Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa, France 24's program focused on the continent. I'm Charlie James, filling in for Georgia Calvin-Smith, and here's what's coming up. Protesters against Sudan's coup aren't giving up their fight. Despite a deadly response from security forces, activists are calling for millions to turn out on Saturday. Uganda's president will reopen schools in January after nearly 2 years of COVID closures. But many teachers have found other jobs as children have started working. And our reporter in Kenya tells you how the nation built a $1 billion tech industry. With huge companies moving in, the demand for local talent has boomed. Thanks so much for joining us today on the program. In Sudan, anti-coup protesters are vowing to keep up their campaign of civil disobedience. Since Monday's military takeover, demonstrators have clashed with security forces daily and faced tear gas, live rounds, and rubber-tipped bullets. Medics report at least 8 people have been killed and 170 wounded. Meanwhile, the Sudanese general who led the coup says he will appoint a technocrat prime minister to rule alongside his forces within days. Our correspondent Bastien Ronhui is in the capital, Khartoum, and sent us more details on the protests.
Several politicians and activists were arrested today in Khartoum, and among all these arrests, one of them is making a lot of noise in the streets and on social networks. It's the one of Nazim Siraj. Nazim is a very well-known activist here in Sudan, and he was part of the demonstrations that led to the fall of Omar al-Bashir in 2019. And since then, he has been helping wounded people to reach hospitals, and he has been keeping track of armed forces brutality. He is sending numbers to journalists and to other activists, so we can keep track of police violence and armed forces repression here in Sudan. But despite all these arrests, people are still motivated and will still take to the street on Saturday. The Sudanese Professional Association that was leading the demonstration in 2019 and the Forces for Freedom and Change, the political coalition that is behind the civilian government here in Sudan, have called people to take to the street massively. They are hoping that millions of people will join them in the street on Saturday to say no to this military coup. They are still asking for the civilian government to get back to power, and they say that they will stay in the street until their demands are met.
As Bastien just said, more protests are planned for Saturday, and the United States is demanding that Sudan's military refrain from violence, saying it will be a key test of their intentions. Uganda's schools are set to reopen in January after what will have been the longest closure in the world due to the coronavirus. Many have criticized the government, saying it isn't doing enough to support vulnerable children who started working in lieu of classes. NGOs warn that many kids may never make it back to the classroom. Kemi Nedelek has the story.
Do you know anything about Ugandans?
School's out in Uganda and has been for almost 2 years. And this is where some school children have ended up, digging in the mud for gold. It's a chance to provide for their families, and besides, there's not much else to do. Distance learning programs failed to get off the ground, and some children feel rudderless. They fear they'll never manage to catch up if they ever do make it back to the classroom.
Staying at home sometimes, you cannot have a morale to read books, and you can just sometimes just forget what they taught at school.
Shops and schools in the country closed in March 2020. 19 months on, Uganda is the only African country where schools are still closed. It's the longest closure anywhere in the world. Schools are set to reopen next year, even though the vaccine rollout has failed to gain momentum. The president is warning that people have a moral responsibility to get vaccinated. A report by Save the Children warned that school closures due to COVID worldwide are the biggest global education emergency of our lifetime, and estimates globally that around 10 million children may never return.
African nations will use next week's COP26 summit to demand rich nations honor and deepen their pledges to fund the fight against climate change. The The two-day UN meeting in Scotland opens Monday and will host leaders from across the world. The African continent wants more funds to help struggling economies curb their emissions and adapt to the impact of climate change.
Fresh UN climate talks open in Scotland on Sunday. Around 200 countries will discuss limiting carbon dioxide emissions. The goal is to prevent the Earth from heating up more than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Meanwhile, Africa says rich countries are falling short of promises to pay $100 billion each year to poorer nations. The targets need to be much more ambitious, according to the African bloc's chief negotiator.
Today, this promise has become obsolete. It is no longer relevant. And yet developed countries are still unable to mobilize the funds. Our view now is that we need to go much further. It is not the maximum goal under the Paris Agreement because the agreement says $100 billion is a minimum.
Sub-Saharan Africa is the most vulnerable to these changes, with severe weather occurrences like droughts or floodings and knock-on effects of rising sea levels and hunger. 6 years ago, at the landmark Paris climate talks, nearly every country in the world set targets for reducing their carbon emissions. But the sum total of their pledges fell short of what is needed. A new UN tally says the world is heading for catastrophic warming of 2.7 degrees Celsius by 2100. July this year was the hottest month ever recorded.
South Africans will vote in municipal elections on Monday, and the race is on to win over last-minute undecided voters. The Western Cape is the only province where the ruling African National Congress does not govern. Its main rival, the Democratic Alliance, has been in power there since 2004. But the DA's stronghold is weakening due to internal conflicts, and the ANC is making its move. Our correspondent Nadine Theron reports.
To win over the hearts of Cape Town's electorate, the African National Congress sends in the heavyweights. President Cyril Ramaphosa is a struggle stalwart and popular with the young and the old.
Since I was born, my family has been in this ANC culture. So anything ANC, everything ANC, because they have supported us, they have done most of the things that I see.
But many young people are disillusioned by the ruling party's promises.
It's been years we've been voting, and it's been years we are saying, and you expect things to get better, but things are getting worse.
It's no wonder the economic freedom fighters, with their promise of radical economic transformation, has gained support in Cape Town. The EFF's leader, Julius Malema, attracted more than 1,000 young people to a campaign rally in Kraaifontein on the city's outskirts.
I think the young people are going to teach the ANC and the DA a serious lesson. It's a shock to me because at some point I was like, this youth has given up. But it looks like they are now reclaiming the political streets and they are ready to charge forward.
Here in Kraaifontein, the EFF encouraged backyard dwellers to occupy state-owned land, which resulted in a new township.
Julius Malema assist us when we took the land. Yes. And the whites, the DA and the ANC, sorry to mention that, but they were not agreeing with us.
But a political analyst says big political parties are disconnected from the youth's priorities of free education, water and electricity.
The election manifestos have not been speaking directly to the unemployed who rely on informality. We are likely to see a change in terms of how people vote.
Nyembezi says independent candidates will likely gain more support than the big parties and have the biggest impact on how Cape Town is governed after November the 1st.
With a $1 billion tech scene and over 200 startups, Kenya has been dubbed a Silicon Savannah. It has recently attracted international tech firms such as Facebook, Microsoft, and IBM, all looking to tap into the rapidly expanding market and growing pool of tech developers. Caroline Kimu examines how Kenya developed their sector.
Billy has been using Netflix for 2 days. When he heard he could use the app for free, he was skeptical. But after calling the company's help center, a representative confirmed that the offer was real and was aimed at attracting new customers in Kenya.
I decided to take it so I could see how the documentaries are in Netflix, and they give you an option to upgrade if you want to watch more than the documentaries that they've offered.
Around 22 million Kenyans are internet users, with 97% accessing it using their mobile phones. This makes the country an attractive prospect for market expansion, and in recent years, established tech giants have set up shop in Kenya.
A few years ago, you couldn't convince either Facebook or Google that we can go to Africa until we began to make investments in infrastructure, and they begin to see the market. You see, they follow the market.
In order to ensure Kenyans are not only customers but a part of the tech revolution, some tech companies are also focusing on education, setting up tech labs or working with private schools to train local talent to global standards.
If you get someone from abroad, you to do quite a bit of training for them to understand how things work around. The local talent understands what challenges you're dealing with and the kind of problems you're trying to solve. And so it's much easier for you to work with them. They bring you more value if you are an organization that is looking for, to build, a development team.
Developing Africa's tech talent is a strategic investment. Google and the International Finance Corporation estimate that by 2025, tech companies could contribute nearly $180 billion to the continent's GDP each year.
That's all for this edition of Eye on Africa, but do stay with us here on France 24. More news and information up next.
When you think of the French capital, you think of beautiful monuments, romantic cafes, pretty parks, but the truth is, for many tourists, Paris is just too dirty.
Whether it's the urine-soaked streets or the ubiquitous dog poop, real, everyday Paris certainly can clash with the postcard version.
Paris authorities have pumped money and manpower into keeping the city clean. So if then, what's the problem? Could it be the Parisians themselves?
Join us as we investigate the capital's filthy reputation.
French Connections Plus on France 24 and France24.com.